Somewhere in the ruins of a Syrian coastal city, archaeologists pulled a clay tablet out of the ground that stopped them cold. It was a letter, written in a hurry, in a hand that scholars describe as unusually rushed, even panicked. And when they translated it, they found a king begging for his life, begging for ships, for grain, for soldiers, describing fires visible from the sea and enemies already on his shores. It was the last letter ever sent from the city of Ugarit, and after it was written, the city vanished. Not declined, not faded, vanished. That's the thing that gets you. Not just that a city fell, cities fall all the time throughout history. What gets you is the silence afterward. No rebuilding, no successor settlement built over the ruins, no mention of Ugarit in any document written after roughly 1185 BC. A city of tens of thousands of people, one of the wealthiest trading hubs in the ancient world, a place with its own alphabet, its own royal palace, its own vast network of international correspondence, just gone, like someone turned off a light. And here's what makes it stranger. Ugarit wasn't alone. Around the same time, something catastrophic swept across the entire eastern Mediterranean. The Hittite Empire, one of the greatest superpowers of the ancient world, collapsed. The Mycenaean Greeks, whose palace culture had lasted centuries, disappeared so completely that the Greeks who came after them had no memory of writing, no memory of the administrative systems, no memory of the world that had existed before. Egypt survived, barely, and emerged permanently weakened. Cyprus burned. Coastal cities from Greece to the Levant were destroyed or abandoned within a generation or two. An entire interconnected world built over centuries came apart almost simultaneously. Historians call it the Late Bronze Age collapse, and it remains one of the most debated catastrophes in all of human history. What caused it? How does an entire network of civilizations fall at once? Was it invasion, drought, earthquake, plague, internal rebellion, or something more like a perfect storm where every pressure hit at the same time? Scholars have been arguing about this for over a century, and the honest answer is that we still don't fully know. What we do have are fragments, burned palace walls, abandoned harbours, grain pits that were never reopened, and letters, desperate, undelivered letters baked into the earth by the very fires that ended the cities that sent them. That last letter from Ugarit is one of those fragments, and it raises a question that genuinely haunts you once you sit with it. If a king powerful enough to run a palace, command a fleet, and correspond with pharaohs could send one final plea into the void and receive nothing in return, what exactly was happening to the world around him? Where were all the great powers? Where were the allies? Where did everybody go? Before we get to the collapse, let's build the world that collapsed. Drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there. I read them, and the geography is always wild. To understand what was lost, you have to understand what Ugarit actually was before everything went wrong. Because this wasn't some minor outpost on the edge of the civilized world. This was one of the most sophisticated, cosmopolitan, and strategically positioned cities on the planet in its time. And its position is where the story starts. Look at a map of the eastern Mediterranean. Find the Syrian coast, that narrow strip of land where the mountains of Lebanon and Syria press close to the sea. Right there, at the northern end of that coastline, tucked into a natural harbour with fresh water nearby, and fertile agricultural land stretching inland, that's where Ugarit sat. The harbour, called Minet el Beida today, meaning the White Harbour, gave Ugarit direct access to the sea lanes that connected Egypt to the south, Cyprus just a day's sail to the west, the Aegean world beyond that, and the great Anatolian powers to the north. Behind the city, overland routes ran east toward Mesopotamia. Ugarit didn't just sit near the crossroads of the ancient world, it was the crossroads. That geography made the city wealthy in ways that are hard to fully grasp. By the 13th century BC, Ugarit was pulling in copper from Cyprus, tin from somewhere in the distant east, cedar timber from the Lebanese mountains, grain from Egypt and the Hittite interior, textiles, wine, oil, ivory, gold. The palace warehouses were enormous. The merchant class was powerful enough that their legal disputes ended up formalized in tablets with royal seals, and the city itself reflected all of this. When archaeologists began excavating the site, called Ras Shamra today, in the 1920s, they found the bones of a city that had been rebuilt and expanded over centuries, layer after layer of occupation going back thousands of years before the final destruction. By its peak, Ugarit covered something like 25 hectares and probably held somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 people within the city walls alone, with more in the surrounding villages and farmland. What they actually found in those ruins paints an almost disarmingly normal picture of daily life. Residential neighbourhoods with multi-storey houses, some of them quite large, with stone foundations, plastered walls, and inner courtyards. Workshop areas where craftsmen produced purple-dyed textiles, using the murex shells found in enormous heaps along the shoreline. Ugaritian purple dye was a luxury export that reached palaces from Egypt to Anatolia. There were smiths working metal, scribes working in at least 5 different languages, and wine merchants with storage jars that still smell faintly of what they once held. Imported goods show up everywhere in the archaeology: Mycenaean pottery in the residential quarters, Egyptian amulets in graves, Cypriot bronze tools in workshops. This was a city where people from different parts of the world lived and worked alongside each other, where international commerce wasn't just an elite activity, but something woven into the texture of daily existence. At the centre of all of it sat the palace, and when you read about it, the scale becomes genuinely striking. The royal palace at Ugarit covered about a hectare on its own, a sprawling complex of courtyards, reception halls, archives, storerooms, and royal apartments. It wasn't just a residence, it was the administrative engine of the entire kingdom. The palace controlled foreign trade, managed agricultural surplus, maintained the archive of diplomatic correspondence, and coordinated the city's relationships with the great powers that surrounded it on all sides. Because Ugarit's position, the same geography that made it rich, also made it complicated. The city sat in a zone of competing imperial interest that required constant diplomatic manoeuvring. To the north, the Hittite Empire under the great kings of Hattusa was the dominant land power of the region, and Ugarit had been a Hittite vassal since roughly the 14th century BC. To the south, Egypt under the pharaohs of the New Kingdom was an equally formidable presence, and Ugarit maintained careful, respectful relationships there too. Cyprus was a close trading partner and sometime rival. The Mycenaean world sent merchants and goods through Ugarit's harbour regularly. Maintaining workable relationships with all of these powers simultaneously required exactly the kind of sophisticated multilingual administrative apparatus that the palace archive preserves. The tablets found there show correspondence with Hittite kings, Egyptian pharaohs, Cypriot rulers, and fellow Levantine city-states. Ugarit was not just a participant in the late Bronze Age world system, it was one of the nodes that held the network together. And that's precisely why its disappearance matters so much for understanding the wider collapse. When archaeologists study the end of Ugarit, they're not studying the fall of one city, they're studying the failure of an entire system. Because everything that made Ugarit function, the trade routes, the diplomatic relationships, the agricultural hinterland supplying the city, the great powers that served as guarantors of regional stability, all of it depended on the same interconnected world that was about to come apart. Ugarit's destruction isn't the story of a city that got unlucky. It's the story of what happens when the structure holding everything together finally gives way. But to understand how that structure broke, you first have to understand just how intricate it was. Picture the late Bronze Age Mediterranean as a single organism, not a collection of separate kingdoms with separate economies doing occasional business with each other, but something more tightly integrated than that. Something where the functioning of one part depended on inputs from 3 or 4 others, where a disruption anywhere in the network sent ripple effects in every direction, where the whole system was, in a very real sense, only as strong as its weakest connection. By around 1300 BC, this world system had been operating for centuries, and it had grown into something genuinely extraordinary. Egypt, the Hittite Empire in Anatolia, the kingdom of Mitanni before its collapse, Babylon in Mesopotamia, Cyprus, the Mycenaean palace states of Greece and Crete, and the Levantine city-states like Ugarit were all bound together by trade relationships, diplomatic marriages, treaty obligations, and mutual economic dependence that would have seemed almost impossibly sophisticated to anyone living just 5 centuries earlier. Historians sometimes call it the International Age, and the name fits. These kingdoms corresponded with each other. Their rulers addressed each other as brothers. Their merchants moved between their ports carrying goods that no single region could produce on its own. And the goods themselves are the key to understanding just how deeply the system had penetrated ordinary economic life. Take copper. The Bronze Age runs on bronze, and bronze requires copper and tin alloyed together. But neither metal occurs in the places that need it most. Cyprus, whose very name may be the origin of the word copper, was the dominant source of copper in the eastern Mediterranean. The island's mines produced massive quantities of the metal, cast into those distinctive oxide-shaped ingots that show up in shipwrecks and palace inventories from Egypt to Greece. But Cyprus needed grain it couldn't fully produce itself, and timber for shipbuilding, and finished luxury goods, and Egyptian gold. So Cypriot copper flowed outward in exchange for everything the island lacked. Tin is an even more revealing case. Bronze Age smiths needed tin to make proper bronze, but tin sources in the eastern Mediterranean are almost non-existent. The metal had to come from somewhere far to the east, possibly Afghanistan, possibly the Taurus Mountains of Anatolia, possibly both, travelling overland through Mesopotamia or across the Syrian plateau before reaching the coastal ports where it could be loaded onto ships. If that supply chain broke down anywhere along its considerable length, bronze production slowed across the entire system. Armies couldn't be equipped, tools couldn't be made, workshops sat idle. The economies of a dozen kingdoms felt the tremor from a disruption that might have originated 1,000 miles away. Grain moved in equally crucial quantities. Egypt was the breadbasket that fed significant portions of the eastern Mediterranean, and Egyptian wheat and barley flowed north and east along the same sea lanes that carried everything else. The Hittite interior produced grain too, but Anatolia was also prone to drought and harvest failure in ways that Egypt, with its reliable Nile floods, generally wasn't. When Hittite kings wrote to their Egyptian counterparts begging for grain shipments, it wasn't a polite diplomatic gesture. It was an emergency request from a kingdom staring at famine. We have those letters. They survive in the diplomatic archives, and what they reveal is a system where food security itself had become dependent on the maintenance of international trade. What held all of this together, the mechanism that actually made it function, was the palace. Not any single palace, but the network of palatial administrative centres that managed redistribution across the Bronze Age world. This is something that takes a moment to really absorb. These weren't market economies in the modern sense, where goods flow through millions of private transactions guided by price signals. They were administered economies, where palaces controlled the collection of agricultural surplus, the storage of commodities against future shortage, the organisation of craft production, and the management of foreign trade. The palace at Ugarit wasn't just a royal residence. It was a redistribution engine, pulling in raw materials and foodstuffs from the surrounding agricultural hinterland, processing them through palace-controlled workshops, and sending finished goods and commodities outward through palace-managed trade networks. Diplomatic gift exchange was a critical part of how this worked at the highest level. When an Egyptian pharaoh sent gold to a Hittite king, and the Hittite king sent back silver and finished textiles, they weren't just being generous to each other. They were lubricating the machinery of the international system, maintaining the relationships of trust and reciprocity that kept trade routes open, disputes manageable, and regional stability intact. The letters in the archive at Tel El Amarna in Egypt, written in the diplomatic language of the age, show kings negotiating these exchanges with meticulous attention to equivalence. Too little gold in one shipment could be read as a slight. Delays in reciprocal gifts generated formal complaints. The whole diplomatic layer of the system required constant maintenance, and underneath all of it, everything ultimately rested on predictable harvests, reliable ships, and passable roads. The system had no buffer against catastrophic failure at its foundations. If the harvest failed, palaces couldn't redistribute. If the ships stopped sailing, copper and tin stopped moving. If the overland routes through Syria and Mesopotamia became unsafe, the eastern supply chains snapped. The system worked magnificently when conditions were stable, because its complexity was precisely calibrated to extract maximum efficiency from a stable environment. It had developed over centuries of relative calm, building independencies and specializations and supply chains that made everyone richer and more productive than they could have been in isolation. But that same complexity was also its deepest vulnerability. Systems theorists have a name for this dynamic. They call it efficiency fragility. The more optimized a complex network becomes for normal conditions, the less capacity it retains to absorb shocks. The Bronze Age world system had been optimizing itself for generations. The redundancies that might have cushioned it against simultaneous failures had been gradually engineered out, replaced by specialization and interdependence. It was, by the 12th century BC, a machine of extraordinary sophistication running with almost no spare margin. What happens to a machine like that when several things go wrong at once is not a gentle decline. It's a cascade. And around 1200 BC, the stresses were beginning to build. If you walk into the ruins of Ugarit today, you don't see the system you just heard about. You see collapsed walls, tumbled stone, the outlines of courtyards and storerooms. It looks like any other ancient ruin. The real heartbeat of that system, the thing that lets us listen in on its last years, survived because the city died badly. When Ugarit burned, it did something for historians that no scribe ever intended. Shelves of clay tablets stored in palace rooms and scrubal houses were suddenly baked in a kiln of collapsing beams and roaring fire. Clay that had been merely dried in the sun, still fragile, still vulnerable to the next damp winter, turned into ceramic. Destruction turned the city's paperwork into something approaching immortal. Without that final fire, most of what we know about Ugarit's last decades would have dissolved back into dust. The archive itself wasn't one neat room with labelled drawers. It was a dispersed bureaucracy embedded in the palace complex and in elite houses nearby. One room might hold diplomatic correspondence with Egypt, the Hittites, and Cyprus. Another might be stacked with legal contracts. A third with accounts, rations, shipping lists. Scribes copied, filed, and occasionally reused tablets. Some texts were neatly arranged on benches, others were probably piled informally, the equivalent of a deal with this later stack on a Bronze Age desk. When the end came, all of that froze in place. What we recover from those rooms falls broadly into a few genres. Each one gives us a different angle on the same slow-motion disaster. First, the diplomatic letters. These are the ones that sound most like the international age you've just heard about. Kings addressing each other as brother, vassals addressing overlords as my lord, my son, officials reminding one another of obligations, gifts, and promises. They're written in Akkadian, the diplomatic lingua franca of the time, in formulas that had been standard for centuries. But by Ugarit's final years, the formulas are straining under the pressure of what they have to contain. A typical letter still opens with elaborate politeness. The sender prostrates himself 7 times and 7 times at the feet of the recipient. The gods of both kingdoms are invoked as witnesses, and then, almost immediately, the tone shifts. A governor complains that grain shipments have not arrived and that his troops are on half rations. A palace official reports that enemy ships have been sighted off the coast and that local garrisons are too weak to respond. A vassal ruler asks for iron weapons and trained men because his own supplies are gone. The formulaic language tries and fails to make this sound ordinary. Then there are the legal records. These are contracts, court decisions, property sales, and marriage agreements. On the surface, they look like the paperwork of a stable society. Disputes over fields, repayments of loans, inheritance arrangements. Read closely, they hint at strain. You see repayment deadlines being extended, interest reduced, land being transferred to cover debts that probably couldn't be paid in grain anymore. You see clauses specifying what happens if the harvest fails, or if the king does not send rations. These weren't theoretical possibilities. You don't write that into a contract unless you expect to need it. Some tablets record disputes over stolen goods from storehouses and caravans. In a world where the roads are safe and the granaries are full, theft is mostly petty. When supplies tighten and caravans disappear, every missing shipment is a crisis. The legal tablets preserve that shift in what counts as worth going to court over. And then there are the shipping lists and administrative accounts. These are the driest documents at first glance. Columns of commodities, measures, destinations, recipients, barley, oil, wine, copper, textiles, oxen assigned to this expedition, rations allotted to those sailors, vessels loaded with such and such cargo for such and such port. But these are precisely the texts that let you see the machine beginning to grind. You can watch allocations shrinking over a span of years, ration lists that once provided full grain allotments for workers, and troops start to show reduced portions, substitutions, special notations. A shipment, as in former days, is now exceptional enough to be remarked on. Inventories of weapons and chariot equipment show gaps, missing items not yet replaced, damaged pieces not yet repaired. Storehouse accounts note shortages of copper or tin, key inputs for the bronze that keeps armies armed and tools in circulation. Sometimes a single line jumps out. A shipment that should have arrived has not come. A convoy is delayed again. A summary note. The remaining grain is not sufficient. You are seeing in real time a redistribution engine losing the resources it needs to function. All of this would be clear enough, but Ugarit's tablets add something else, a tone. Even filtered through formal Akkadian and elite scribal conventions, anxiety leaks through. We have letters where high officials practically plead. One famously terse note from the viceroy of Carchemish to the king of Ugarit scolds him for not sending an agreed shipment, insisting that you must not neglect the matter, and implying that the Hittite overlord is displeased. Reading between the lines, Ugarit simply may not have had the goods to send. Other letters go in the opposite direction. Ugarit's king begging others. He complains of enemy ships, of lands laid waste, of an inability to move grain or troops safely. Later in the script we'll hear his final message, but the earlier letters in the archive show that this last cry for help wasn't a sudden panic. It was the culmination of years of increasingly urgent requests. Ship captains write about crews who haven't been paid. Local officials ask for soldiers because they cannot keep order with what they have. Even scribes, usually invisible behind their formulas, occasionally slip in phrases that suggest fear. The matter is very serious. The land is in distress. The overall picture is a palace and a city still trying to play their assigned role in the world system, still writing the correct formulas, still stamping seals on tablets, while the assumptions that made those formulas meaningful are crumbling. But there's a catch. We only have this picture in fragments. The fire that preserved the tablets also destroyed many of them, and 3,000 years of being buried in the ground didn't help. A huge number of Ugaritic texts are broken, with large portions missing. Cracks slice through lines, corners are gone, whole tablets are reduced to a handful of surviving signs. That means our reconstruction of Ugarit's last years rests on partial sentences and educated guesses. Sometimes a letter preserves only its opening and a jagged chunk of the middle. We know who wrote to whom, and that enemy ships, or grain, or famine were mentioned, but we don't know what was actually being asked or promised. Other times we get the conclusion of a letter, send quickly, do not delay, may the gods protect you, without the crisis that prompted it. Context is another problem. A shipping list that looks unremarkable on its own might, in context, be the last normal shipment before a long silence. But unless we can securely date every tablet and align them by year, the sequence of events remains fuzzy. Different scholars propose slightly different chronologies for the final decade of Ugarit based on how they read these texts. And even when the tablets are intact, the language isn't always straightforward. The Ugaritic scribes wrote in multiple languages and scripts. Akkadian for international correspondence, Ugaritic written in its own cuneiform alphabet for local matters, occasionally Hittite, Hurrian or Egyptian glosses. Each language has its own conventions, idioms and polite evasions. Phrases that sound literal in English may have been stock metaphors in Akkadian. A statement like, "the land is very bad," could be a set way of saying, "times are hard," or it could be a specific reference to drought, crop failure or invasion. Words we translate as enemy might refer to a particular ethnic group, to generic raiders, or to rival city-states, depending on context that we don't always have. Different translators make different choices. One might render a phrase as "the ships of the enemy have come," another as "enemy boats keep appearing." The emotional weight you feel reading those lines shifts subtly, depending on how the verbs are understood. Multiply that by hundreds of tablets, and you get a picture of Ugarit's last years that is vivid, but not perfectly sharp. We can see anxiety, shortages, urgent requests. We can hear the voices in clay, but we should be cautious about turning every phrase into a precise data point in a modern narrative. What the archive really gives us is not a timeline, but a feeling, a sense of a palace world that is over-administered, over-connected, and suddenly under-resourced. A place where people who had spent their lives counting shipments, drafting treaties, and balancing accounts are confronted with problems their paperwork can no longer solve. And in that atmosphere, one king, facing enemies by sea and land and watching his supplies dwindle, sat down, through his scribes, to send a final, desperate message. The message itself is short, brutally short considering what it's trying to do. It doesn't lay out a full situation report. It doesn't recite a long history of obligations and favours. It doesn't even waste much time on the elaborate politeness that usually opens a royal letter. It reads like someone who no longer has the luxury of ceremony. On a small clay tablet in wedge-shaped Akkadian signs, a king of Ugarit dictated something close to this, depending on how you translate it. My father, now the enemy ships are here. My cities have been burned, and they have done evil things in my country. Does not my father know that all my troops and chariots are in the land of Hatti, and all my ships are in the land of Luka? Thus the land is abandoned to itself. May my father know it. Now, the 7 ships of the enemy that have come have done evil things. If there are any other enemy ships, let my father inform me. That's it. That's the famous last letter of Ugarit, in its most commonly reconstructed form. A compressed, panicked status update from a man watching his world fall apart faster than he can get the words out. We don't know his exact name from this tablet alone. Most scholars think it was Amurapi, the last known king of Ugarit, ruling in the late 13th and early 12th centuries BC. He shows up in other tablets from the final years, dealing with routine matters that no longer look routine in hindsight. The style and content of the message match those years. The recipient is called My Father and My Son, standard titles for a superior king. That narrows the field. This is almost certainly addressed to the Hittite king, quite possibly Suppiluliuma II, Ugarit's formal overlord to the north. Some have suggested the great Hittite viceroy at Carchemish instead, a kind of regional supervisor. The broken state of the tablet and the formulaic language leave room for debate, but in practice it doesn't change much. Whoever my father was, the hierarchy is clear. Ugarit is the small client kingdom. The addressee is the empire that's supposed to protect it. And that is precisely the problem laid bare in the letter. In a few sentences, Amurapi, or whichever king it was, admits something no Bronze Age ruler ever wants to put on record. His defences are empty. He tells his overlord that his troops and chariots are away in Hatti, serviceable shorthand for off-fighting the Hittite king's wars somewhere inland. His ships, which should be guarding his own coastline, are instead in the land of Luka, probably southwestern Anatolia, another troubled frontier. In other words, the hardware of Ugarit's security, its trained soldiers, its chariot corps, its navy, has been pulled into the wider imperial system. The city has spent years paying into the protection racket of the late Bronze Age, sending troops to Hittite campaigns, sending ships to patrol foreign waters, sending grain and goods wherever the network demanded. And now, when danger finally arrives at its own harbour, it is naked. The phrase, "thus the land is abandoned to itself," is one of the most chilling lines we have from the entire late Bronze Age collapse. It's not just a poetic complaint. It's a technical description of a state with no active protection. In a normal year, that wouldn't be a permanent condition. Garrisons rotate, fleets come and go. A king can write to his father and ask for troops back, or for fresh contingents to be sent. But the letter doesn't sound like it's talking about a normal year. My cities have been burned. Not my city might be attacked. Not, there is a danger of enemy landing. The verb is past tense. Damage has already been done, and not on some distant frontier. In my country. The enemy ships aren't hypothetical. Now the enemy ships are here. Later he specifies the 7 ships of the enemy that have come. 7 doesn't sound like much in a modern navy, but for the late Bronze Age Eastern Mediterranean, 7 hostile warships appearing unannounced off a vulnerable coast could be disastrous. If you picture a world where most maritime traffic is predictable, royal fleets, merchant convoys on known routes, 7 aggressive, unknown vessels are an alarm bell. They can raid undefended ports, cut coastal roads, torch storage facilities, abduct or kill coastal farmers and fishermen. They don't need to conquer the city outright to cripple its economy. But the king doesn't specify who these enemies are. That's telling. He doesn't say the Egyptians or the Hittites or name a neighbouring kingdom. The word is generic. Hostile ships, raiders, invaders. Later historians will bundle these kinds of attackers under the label sea peoples, but that's our term, constructed from scattered Egyptian and Near Eastern references. He never uses it. This ambiguity is part of what makes the letter feel so immediate. The king isn't analysing ethnic origins or debating diplomatic theory. He's dealing with armed men on boats burning his cities, so what does he actually want? On the surface, he's asking for information. If there are any other enemy ships, let my father inform me. That might sound anticlimactic after the dramatic opening. Why not say, send troops, recall my army, defend me? One possibility is that he doesn't need to spell it out. Within the etiquette of royal correspondence, simply informing your overlord that your cities are burning is already a request for help. The Hittite king, if he can, is supposed to respond. Another reading is more bleak. The wider situation by this point may have been so chaotic that the most realistic thing the king can ask for is warning. If more enemy fleets are on the move, he wants to know from someone with a broader view of the sea lanes. Help, in that sense, would mean intelligence, not necessarily soldiers. Still, when historians try to unpack what help could have meant here, they usually land on a few concrete possibilities. First, ships. The overlord could recall Ugarit's own navy from Lucca, or dispatch Hittite warships if any were available. Even a small squadron could contest raiders, escort grain convoys, and show the flag along a threatened coast. Second, troops and chariots. Ugarit's land forces stuck in distant campaigns might be redirected, or Hittite contingents stationed elsewhere could be ordered south. Bronze Age armies moved slowly, but garrisons at key inland cities could, in theory, march to Ugarit's aid if roads and supplies were intact. Third, grain and supplies. If the raids were coinciding with poor harvests, something other texts from the region suggest, then food aid could stabilize the city while its own fields lay ravaged. A Hittite grain convoy, escorted by troops or ships, would be a material lifeline. Fourth, political pressure. If these enemy ships were backed by some rival power, the great king at Hattusa might still have had diplomatic levers to pull. Threats, negotiations, pressure on shared vassals, attempts to peel off allies from the raiders. All of those are imaginable. None of them show up in the archaeological record of Ugarit's last days. We have the letter. We don't have a reply. No answering tablet has been found in the ruins saying, "Do not fear, troops are on their way," or even, "We cannot help you." That silence might be accidental. Archives are partial everywhere, and Hattusa's own records were largely destroyed. A reassuring response could have existed, been dispatched, and simply not survived. But when you put the missing answer next to the charred remains of Ugarit's palaces, the layers of destruction, the abrupt halt in its administrative records, the silence feels like part of the story. The King's Plea has become one of the most quoted texts from the Late Bronze Age precisely because it stands alone. It is a voice mid-sentence, cut off by events we can only reconstruct from ruins. We don't know whether the message reached its destination before the city fell. We don't know how many days or weeks passed between the moment the scribe pressed the last wedge into the clay and the moment the beams overhead caught fire. We don't know if anyone ever read it and tried to act on it, or if it rode on some ship that never made it out of the harbour. What we do know is that Ugarit did not survive long enough for its bureaucracy to record any successful rescue. No tablet says, "The troops have arrived." No account notes new grain from the north refilling the storehouses. The archive ends in mid-crisis. The king asked, as clearly as a Bronze Age monarch ever could, for the system he'd served to protect him. In the next phase of the story, we'll see what was coming at him from both directions, by sea and by land, and why even the greatest powers of the age were no longer in a position to answer. From Ugarit's point of view, the danger had a simple shape. Ships on the horizon, smoke on the wind. From our point of view, it's much messier. Later historians give those ships a dramatic label, the Sea Peoples. It sounds like a single organised nation sweeping down on the civilised world, almost like an ancient version of Vikings or pirates with a flag and a home base. The problem is, the ancient sources never make it that neat. The clearest, loudest voice about these seaborne enemies doesn't come from Ugarit at all. It comes from Egypt, hundreds of kilometres to the south, on carved walls and boastful inscriptions. In the reign of Rameses III, decades after Ugarit was already ash, Egyptian artists filled the temple of Medinet Habu with sprawling battle scenes. Longboats crammed with warriors, feathered headdresses, horned helmets, chariots rolling along the shore. The accompanying text presents Rameses as the saviour of the world, defeating a coalition of foreign peoples who had made a conspiracy in their islands and were sweeping across the eastern Mediterranean, destroying everyone in their path. Their names are carved one after another: Shurden, Shekelesh, Peleset, Denyen, Jekka, Weshesh. Some of those names sound tantalizingly familiar. Peleset might be connected to the Philistines who appear in the Hebrew Bible. Denyen has been linked, very cautiously, to groups remembered later as Danans or Danites. Shurden sounds a bit like Sardinia. But these are guesses layered onto guesses. What we can say is that the Egyptians believed multiple foreign groups, partly seaborne, partly overland, were moving as a loose confederation, attacking Hittite territory, ravaging Syria, Cyprus and Canaan, and finally pushing on Egypt itself. From their point of view, this was a crisis so big it needed to be carved in stone forever. But here's the catch. Egyptian royal inscriptions are propaganda. They're written to magnify the king's glory, not to give us a balanced news report. If Rameses III tells us that his enemies laid waste to the land as if never having existed, we have to remember that exaggeration is part of the genre. He's turning a messy regional disaster into a clean story with one villain, those people, and one hero, himself. And Egypt, importantly, survived. It staggered, lost wealth and territory, but its royal line continued. Hyping the threat makes the king's survival look even more impressive. Ugarit didn't get to write its version on temple walls. Its story is preserved in the most fragile way possible, chance-baked clay. When we turn from Egyptian reliefs to Levantine evidence, the actual ground where Ugarit stood, the picture blurs. We don't find inscriptions saying, "On this day, the sea peoples came." We find burned palaces, collapsed storerooms, smashed jars, arrowheads in the destruction layers, abrupt breaks in administrative tablets. We find ports that stop functioning, trade goods that stop arriving, elites who never rebuild. In the archives of Ugarit and neighbouring cities, we do see hints of something broader stirring in the background. References to enemies, to people from the sea, to trouble in Cyprus and along the Anatolian coast. But nothing organises itself neatly into the sea peoples with capital letters. That's the first part of the problem. The second is who these enemies actually were. When Rameses III shows us boatloads of warriors, it's tempting to imagine pure raiders, men with swords chasing loot. But if you look closely at his own scenes, you see more than that. Among the fighters, there are ox carts, women and children. Whole households on the move. In other words, some of these groups weren't just raiding. They were migrating. It's entirely possible that what crashed into the vulnerable coasts of the eastern Mediterranean around 1200 BC was not a single ethnic group or even a single people, but a stormfront of mixed human movement, bands of dislocated warriors trying to carve out new territories, mercenaries laid off by failing kingdoms, taking their skills freelance, pirate crews, yes, taking advantage of the weak defences, but also families with no fields left at home, loading their possessions onto carts and ships, following rumours of better land and richer cities. The Egyptian texts from their own angle support this. They mention that some of these groups had already seized lands in Syria and Canaan, that they came from the midst of the sea, but were also travelling by land, that they were coming, their hearts confident. That confidence might not come from random raiding. It might come from the knowledge that the old powers were crumbling and that whole populations were on the move behind them. For a city like Ugarit, this distinction, raider, mercenary, migrant, probably didn't matter in the moment. What mattered was that ships had appeared and cities were burning. But in the long view, it suggests that the enemy ships in the king's letter could have held a mix of motives and identities. Maybe one of those 7 ships carried hardened soldiers from somewhere in the Aegean, men who had already fought as mercenaries for the Hittites or Egyptians and knew exactly how to hit a coastal warehouse. Maybe another carried uprooted farmers looking for a place to settle, willing to participate in violence if it opened a door. Maybe some crews were composed of local Levantines, deserting collapsing armies and joining the strongest predators they could find. If you imagine the late Bronze Age world system as a tightly stretched net of obligations and trade, by 1185 BC, that net was tearing in multiple places at once. People were falling through. Some of those people grabbed onto ships. And while Ugarit was watching the sea, the land around it was not standing still. The letter to the Hittite king makes it sound like the biggest problem is naval. Enemy ships, my ships in the land of Luca. But that vulnerability only exists because the landward situation is already dangerous. Hatti, the great Hittite kingdom that Ugarit depended on, was under extreme pressure on all fronts. To the west, in western Anatolia, rebellious vassals and rival powers were testing its borders. To the east, Assyria was growing stronger, nibbling at Hittite influence. Internally, succession disputes and resource shortages were straining the imperial centre. This matters for Ugarit because its troops and chariots weren't away on a peaceful tour. They were probably sucked into this whirlpool of Hittite land campaigns, putting down rebellions, reinforcing far-off garrisons, showing the flag in contested regions. Every time Hattusa felt threatened, it reached down the chain of vassals and pulled manpower upwards. Closer to home, Ugarit's own land frontiers were never entirely safe. To the northeast and east lay other Syrian city-states and semi-independent territories, Amurru, Carchemish, smaller polities that shifted alliance between Hatti and Egypt over generations. Old grudges and border disputes didn't disappear just because everyone nominally served the same great king. Frontier governors launched opportunistic raids when they smelled weakness. Local warlords watched for undefended caravans. To the south, along the coast, Canaanite cities and emerging groups in the inland hills were dealing with their own crises. Some of those inland communities, later remembered as early Israelites and other highland groups, may have been absorbing people fleeing coastal and lowland turmoil. That kind of demographic shuffle tends to produce banditry, small-scale raids, and clashes over pasture and water. We also have indications from letters and treaties that the region around Ugarit was plagued by Apiru or Habiru, a catch-all term used by Near Eastern scribes for rootless bands. Runaway soldiers, displaced peasants, outlaws, sometimes hired as mercenaries, sometimes feared as raiders. They were a symptom of states losing tight control over their populations. All of this created a landward environment that felt jittery even before the ship showed up. Imagine being in Ugarit's palace in those final years. Inland couriers bring word that Hittite authority is fraying, that some vassals aren't paying what they owe, that rebels in one region have torched royal estates. Another report arrives. Bandits on the trade road have hit a caravan, and the local governor is demanding more troops. At the same time, messengers from coastal watchposts mention strange sails, unfamiliar weaponry, rumours from Cyprus of cities attacked without warning. Traders whisper that ports they used to call at are now smoking ruins, that some rulers have vanished without a trace. From the king's throne, the map doesn't show a single arrow labelled sea peoples pointing at Ugarit. It shows arrows from everywhere. North, Hittite demands for men and supplies getting more frantic as the centre weakens. East, rival elites and restless dependents probing for advantage. South, instability in Canaan, new groups rising in the hills, old city-states wobbling. West, the open water full of rumours and 7 very real hostile ships. That's the backdrop to the phrase, "Thus the land is abandoned to itself." Not just the absence of his own troops and ships, but the sense that the entire protective shell of the late Bronze Age order is cracked. No direction feels safe. The Sea Peoples, in this light, aren't a single cause of Ugarit's downfall. They're one expression of a wider breakdown, one that sends threats toward the city from both surf and soil. In the next part of the story, we'll watch what happens when those pressures finally snap the lines that kept food, metal and information flowing. Because for a city like Ugarit, enemies with swords are terrifying. But enemies that cut your supply routes can kill you just as surely, and often more quietly. If you live in a coastal palace in the late Bronze Age, you don't fear the economy. You fear empty docks. Ugarit's power didn't come from an army marching across open plains every summer. It came from 1,000 unremarkable arrivals and departures, merchantmen hugging the coast, royal transports from Cyprus, grain ships from Egypt, small packets of tin moving under guard from somewhere far away and mysterious. As long as those kept showing up, the system worked. Kings could write annoyed letters, threaten each other about late cargoes, juggle shortages with promises of the next shipment. The whole world ran on the assumption that yes, the ship is late, but it will arrive. Now imagine when that assumption stops being safe. Maritime insecurity doesn't have to mean a full blockade with neat lines of enemy vessels on the horizon. It can start with whispers. Avoid that stretch of coast, pirates have been sighted. A captain diverts around a dangerous bay and loses a week. A port governor refuses to let ships sail without extra guards and waits for more soldiers to arrive. Insurance, informal as it was, goes up. Risk premiums creep into everything. Then a ship simply doesn't come back. We have letters from this period, some from Ugarit, some from neighbouring states, complaining that cargoes have gone missing, that the enemy is on the sea lanes, that some harbours are no longer safe. A king of Alashia, probably Cyprus, protests that he is not responsible for sea raiders operating off his coast, swearing that his own people are innocent. The very fact that he has to say this tells you trust is evaporating. Once a few ships are taken, fear does the rest. Merchants decide that the profit isn't worth the risk. Royal administrators, who have to account for every lost ingot, postpone departures until things quiet down. Local officials start holding ships in port, waiting for convoys that never quite materialize. What had been a smooth flow of traffic turns jerky. Delays pile on delays, routes get abandoned, and some links in the chain simply snap. For Ugarit, that's lethal because of what's actually moving on those ships. Take bronze. On paper, we talk about a Bronze Age as if bronze is just part of the decor. In practice, bronze is military hardware, agricultural equipment, religious prestige. It's the cutting edge of everything that makes a palace economy function. But bronze doesn't exist in nature. It's an alloy, about 9 parts copper, 1 part tin. Copper, Ugarit could get. The Eastern Mediterranean had known copper sources for millennia, especially in Cyprus. Copper ingots, often cast in that iconic oxide shape, turn up all over the region. Tin, though, is the problem. There are no rich tin deposits in Syria. Ancient tin probably came from much farther away. Central Anatolia, maybe the eastern mountains, perhaps even beyond, funneled through long land routes and coastal exchanges. However exactly it travelled, one thing is clear. It was scarce, and it moved through choke points. If the sea around Cyprus and the southern Anatolian coast becomes dangerous, if overland caravans are being hit by bandits or cut off by wars, it's not the copper that disappears first, it's the tin. Lose tin, and you don't immediately lose bronze. You lose the ability to replace it. Spearheads can't be endlessly reforged, chisel blades dull, ploughshares break, chariot fittings corrode. In a stable system, you send off for new metal, the smiths fire up their furnaces, and life goes on. In a strained system, every broken tool becomes an accounting problem. There are hints in the tablets from this period of exactly that kind of strain. Rulers complain of lacking good copper, of being unable to fulfill agreed quantities of finished bronze. Requests for metal become more urgent, more defensive in tone. When arsenical copper or lower quality alloys start to appear more often in the archaeological record, many scholars suspect that this reflects tin tightening, people stretching what they have, substituting inferior metals when the real thing is too hard to get. Militaries feel this immediately. Chariots, those prestige weapons of the late Bronze Age, are maintenance monsters. They need metal for wheel fittings, axles, linchpins, not to mention weapons for the warriors they carry. If your vassal's chariotry is away with the Hittite king, and you can't get enough bronze to keep your own garrison fully armed, your city's defences aren't just undermanned, they're under-equipped. But the palace doesn't live on bronze, it lives on grain. The entire late Bronze Age political structure is built around one basic transaction. Peasants grow crops, the palace takes a share as tax, and in return, the palace redistributes food when and where it's needed. To chariot warriors, to temple staff, to craft specialists, to dependent labourers, and in bad years, to starving villagers. That means grain storage is political survival. Archaeology at Ugarit and comparable sites has revealed massive storage facilities, magazines full of jars, silos for cereals, warehouses stacked with goods. Clay tablets record allocations of grain to named workers, to foreign envoys, to distant garrisons. There are even references to emergency distributions after poor harvests. As long as trade is working, a shortfall in one region can be padded over by surplus from another. If Syria has a drought but Egypt has a good Nile flood, grain ships can cross the sea. If coastal fields fail but inland valleys do well, caravans can carry the difference. When the supply lines start failing, every bad harvest becomes far more dangerous. We know that parts of the eastern Mediterranean were experiencing climate stress around this time, evidence of drought, shortened growing seasons, more variable rainfall. Even if Ugarit itself had decent local yields some years, neighbouring regions might not. Grain that used to move freely between these zones now faced raiders, unsafe ports, unreliable allies. Inside the palace, that translates into agonising arithmetic. Who gets fed first? The professional soldiers guarding the walls? The chariot corps currently away but due back any month? The scribes and craftsmen who keep the machinery of the palace turning? Or the farmers whose fields failed, who will remember being turned away? Under this pressure, rationing becomes both a practical tool and a weapon. We have late Bronze Age documents where rations are cut, where workers are reassigned, where some categories of dependents seem to simply vanish from the lists. People on the receiving end of those cuts don't experience it as macroeconomic adjustment. They experience hunger. Prices spike in markets that had previously been insulated by palace control. Bread gets smaller, beer weaker. Merchants start hoarding, waiting for better rates. Ordinary families sell jewellery, tools, even their freedom to buy food. The number of people entering debt bondage tends to rise in such crises. Disorder follows. Petty theft increases. Grain stores become tempting targets for everyone from organised rebels to hungry dock workers. Guards have to be posted, then more guards to watch the guards. Now put another layer on top: broken communication. The palaces of the late Bronze Age didn't just move grain and metal, they moved information. Clay tablets flew back and forth with dizzying speed, carried by couriers along established routes. Kings complaining about delayed shipments, asking for military aid, negotiating marriages, reporting crop prospects, assuring each other that everything was, for the moment, under control. This correspondence isn't gossip, it's coordination. If Ugarit knows that Hatti had a poor harvest, it can lower expectations about tribute demands. If Cyprus reports pirate trouble, Ugarit can reroute its own ships or send escorts. If Egypt promises a grain convoy, Ugarit might dare to open its storerooms a little wider, confident that help is on the way. But if messengers are robbed, roads unsafe, and ports burning, this system begins to fail in the worst possible way, unevenly. Some letters still get through, but late. Others never arrive. A warning sent from one court may be found, unbaked, in the ashes of another centuries later by archaeologists. A message written, sealed, and never read. From a king's perspective, that's a nightmare. Are your allies ignoring you, or just unable to answer? Did the Hittite king refuse your plea for troops, or did the tablet never reach his hands? Has that grain convoy been sunk, or is it merely delayed by cautious captains? Uncertainty eats planning alive. So palace officials plan for the worst. They hoard, they hesitate to commit troops they might desperately need at home, they stop extending credit to foreign partners. A system that once depended on trust and reciprocity turns inward and brittle. And on the streets below, all of these abstract stresses condense into fear. A dock worker doesn't know about tin supply from Anatolia. He knows that there are fewer ships to unload and that his ration of barley has been cut. A farmer outside the city walls doesn't understand the nuances of Hittite succession. She knows that officials have come to take the same tax as before, even though the fields yielded less, and that rumours say the palace granaries are full for now. Shopkeepers see prices rising and customers disappearing. Temple staff hear that certain festivals will be simplified this year, meaning fewer sacrificial animals, fewer feasts. Soldiers notice that their replacement spearheads are of poorer metal, that their pay is late, that their officers look worried. Street gossip stitches these observations together into stories. The king is hiding food. Foreigners are to blame. The gods are angry. The Hittite overlord has abandoned us. Enemy ships are blocking the harbour. The palace is selling off bronze to pay debts. Some of these rumours might be wildly wrong. Others might be uncomfortably close to the truth. Either way, trust erodes. When trust erodes in a system built on palace promises, people look for other protectors. Local strongmen, kin groups, bandit leaders who offer security in exchange for loyalty. That in turn makes the official order even shakier. By the time our panicked king of Ugarit is scratching out his last plea, enemy ships are here, my troops and my ships are away, thus the land is abandoned to itself. The collapse of supply isn't a distant threat. It's already happening in 1,000 small disruptions. The ship that didn't arrive, the caravan that turned back, the letter that never reached its destination. When the supply lines snapped, they didn't just cut off bronze and grain. They severed the invisible threads of reassurance that let a late Bronze Age city believe tomorrow would look like today. Once those threads are gone, it doesn't take much fire to finish the job. And beneath all of this ran another deeper stressor, one that no king could command or negotiate with. The climate itself was shifting under their feet. When scholars talk about the end of the Bronze Age, they almost always bring up drought. Not because one day the rain just stopped and everyone died, but because over the span of a few human lifetimes, The rules of the seasons seem to have changed in ways that our late Bronze Age system was not built to handle. We don't have weather reports from 1200 BC. No one at Ugarit was writing, "Another year of below-average rainfall, Your Majesty." What we do have is something stranger. The fingerprints that climate leaves on mud, pollen, shells and ice. Take pollen, for example. Every year, plants throw microscopic grains into the air. Some of those fall into lakes and bogs and settle to the bottom, layer after layer, like pages in a book. A few thousand years later, a scientist takes a long, hollow tube, pushes it into that mud, and pulls out a history of what grew around that water over time. When they do this around the eastern Mediterranean, something interesting shows up near the late Bronze Age collapse. In earlier layers, you see lots of pollen from trees and crops that like moisture: oaks, olive trees, certain cereals. Then, around the 13th to 12th centuries BC, those signals weaken. Instead, you get more pollen from hardy scrub vegetation, plants that don't mind if the rains fail or the soil dries out. In some cores, the change is abrupt enough that it looks less like a gentle shift and more like a shock. Other lines of evidence tell similar stories. Lake levels drop. Ancient shorelines, beach deposits, and the chemistry of lake sediments in places like the Dead Sea, the Sea of Galilee, and inland basins in Anatolia all suggest that water bodies shrank or became saltier in the centuries around 1200 BC. That usually happens when evaporation outpaces inflow, when snowmelt and rainfall aren't keeping up. Then there are isotopes, the tiny ratios of different forms of oxygen and other elements locked into shells, stalagmites, and even grains of calcite. When the climate is warm or dry, the balance between these isotopes shifts in detectable ways. Cave formations in the Levant, marine cores off the coast, and even Greenland ice all show signals of a more erratic, often drier climate in the eastern Mediterranean at just the time our tablets from Ugarit start sounding nervous. None of these by itself proves a single giant super drought that sweeps from Greece to Egypt in one neat wave. The data are patchy. Some places look drier earlier, some later. There are arguments about how long the dry phases lasted and how severe they were, but if you step back, a pattern emerges. Around the decades when Ugarit burns, a wide arc of the eastern Mediterranean and Near East seems to be dealing with reduced rainfall, more variable seasons, and repeated agricultural stress. On a modern climate graph, it's a jagged line. On the ground, for a farming kingdom like Ugarit, it's something much more visceral. Start in the fields. Most of the people who fed Ugarit didn't live in the city. They ploughed terraces, irrigated valleys, and dry-farmed hillsides inland. Their cereal crops, wheat, barley, maybe some pulses, depend on the delicate timing of winter rains and spring moisture. A few weeks of missing rain at the wrong time can mean the difference between a full harvest and a field of stunted stalks. In a normal system, bad years happen. Maybe 1 in 5 is poor, 1 in 10 truly awful. Palaces exist in part to smooth that out. They store surplus in good years, redistribute in bad years, call on neighbours when both happen at once. But if the pattern shifts so that bad years start coming every other year, or clusters of dry years hit too close together, the buffers erode. The first thing to go is margin. Peasants eat their seed grain. Oxen are slaughtered because there isn't enough fodder to keep them through the winter. Orchards are neglected or cut down for firewood. Trees take years to regrow, so that's a long-term hit baked into a short-term survival decision. From the palace side, tax registers suddenly don't add up. Officials are supposed to collect a certain fraction of the harvest in kind: grain, oil, wine. That revenue feeds not just the court, but the army, the temples, and the craft specialists who don't farm at all. When the harvest is lousy, rulers face a cruel choice: lower taxes to keep farmers alive, or demand the usual amounts and risk pushing people over the edge. There are hints in late Bronze Age texts of both strategies. In some years, kings boast of remitting taxes, of generosity. In others, they send stern reminders that the due amounts must be delivered. Under repeated drought stress, the generous years become harder to afford. Now fold climate into the trading system we talked about earlier. Ugarit's coastal location is a blessing in good times. If its hinterland is dry but Egypt has had a good Nile flood, grain can be purchased or demanded from the pharaoh. If inland Syria is suffering, maybe Cyprus or the Aegean can make up some of the deficit with wine and oil in exchange. But drought rarely respects political boundaries. If rainfall patterns shift across a whole region, Egypt might be struggling with low Niles at the same time that Syria's winter rains falter. Anatolian uplands might be losing snowpack. That means everyone is short at once. The letters we have from around this period show kings begging for grain, promising to pay back later, or complaining that promised shipments have not arrived. When multiple partners in a network are all experiencing shortfalls, those promises start to sound hollow. Trade routes that once moved luxuries first, fine textiles, tin, prestige goods, start carrying bulk food instead. But bulk food is heavy, vulnerable, and expensive to move. A convoy of grain is far more tempting to raiders than a small chest of jewellery. In a world already noticing more pirates, more banditry, and more insecure roads, climate-stressed grain shipments become high-risk ventures. The result is vicious feedback. Drought shrinks harvests. Shrinking harvests cut tax revenue. Lower revenue means the palace has less to pay soldiers, guard caravans, or hire escorts for ships. Less protection makes trade riskier, so less food and metal get through. That makes the next bad harvest even more dangerous, because there is no external cushion left. People don't just sit and starve in place. One of the things that drought does, especially repeated droughts, is pry people loose from their land. If your family plot has failed 3 years in a row, and the local lord still expects his due, you can either slide into debt bondage, selling your labour, your children, even your person, or you can leave. Archaeologists see signs of increased movement in this period. Abandoned rural sites, new small settlements in marginal zones, shifts in material culture that suggest populations on the move. Egyptian texts talk about groups arriving at their borders begging for water, asking to graze their flocks in the delta. Hittite and Syrian inscriptions mention nomads and wanderers in greater numbers. Now imagine trying to run a kingdom like Ugarit while waves of displaced people are drifting through your countryside. Some of them might be welcomed as labour if you can feed them. Others might turn to raiding if you can't. Local chiefs might recruit them as private muscle. Border regions become volatile, harder to police, more prone to conflict with neighbours who are dealing with the same stresses. Climate, in that sense, is an amplifier. It doesn't invent human fear, greed, or violence. It turns the volume up on all of them. A dry decade doesn't automatically burn cities. What it does is make every policy error, every feud, every delayed shipment more consequential. A tax demand that might have been tolerated in a good year becomes a spark in a lean year. A bandit raid that would have been repelled when the garrison was well fed and well paid becomes a disaster when the watch is thin and resentful. For Ugarit, the vulnerability is structural. The city's wealth and status come from its position as a coastal broker between inland producers and overseas partners. Its palace economy relies on grain from its hinterland and from vassal territories further inland, places that feel climate stress earlier and more directly than the royal scribes on the coast. If upland villages fail, if interior river valleys dry up, Ugarit doesn't just lose a harvest. It loses tax base, surplus to trade, and political leverage over the countryside. A coastal kingdom can't eat ships and tablets. It has to convert them back into food, and that requires someone, somewhere, getting a decent harvest. By the time enemy ships appear off the coast and the king of Ugarit is writing that his land is abandoned to itself, it's likely that this abandonment has been going on quietly for years in the fields, families slipping away, terraces crumbling, orchards dying back. But climate is not destiny. Even in the same period, some regions seem to cope better than others. Some polities bend without breaking, adjusting tax burdens, reorganizing land, cutting back military commitments or tightening central control. Others, like Ugarit, are caught between obligations they can't meet and dependencies they can't escape. When the rains falter, the system doesn't die in a single season. It frays. And into those frayed edges, failed harvests, hungry migrants, nervous soldiers, unpaid captains, other forces begin to press. Not just drought, but enemies with their own reasons for moving, raiding, and burning. The climate was shifting, the seas were dangerous, the granaries were under strain. All of that set the stage for what happened next, on a specific night when warnings turned into fire and the city of Ugarit stopped writing letters forever. We don't have a diary from the last night of Ugarit. No one sat down and wrote, "At sunset we saw their sails." No one described the smoke thickening in the streets, or the moment when they realized the palace was lost. What we do have is something colder, and in a way more brutal. The physical aftermath, burnt mud brick, collapsed rafters, rooms frozen in mid-use, and inside those rooms the clay voices we've been reading this whole time. Archaeologists don't excavate a single moment. They dig through layers of time. At Ugarit, when you peel back the soil from the late Bronze Age city, you eventually hit a very distinctive horizon. Below it, normal occupation. House floors that were trampled and repaired. Hearths with ash from yesterday's cooking fire and the one before that. Trash pits full of broken pottery, animal bones, and all the usual debris of life. Then suddenly across a wide area the story snaps. You reach a band of destruction. What archaeologists blandly call a burn layer. Charred beams, walls fallen inward, roof tiles and plaster collapsed onto floors. On top of that, later dust and wind-blown sand. No rebuild, no new floor packed down over the ruins. At Ugarit, that destruction layer sits like a lid. Once it's in place, the city's voice stops. When you look closely, that layer tells you the end was violent and hot. In some parts of the site, the temperatures got high enough to vitrify mud brick, to fuse plaster, to redden stones. That doesn't happen from a few cooking fires getting out of hand. It suggests large, sustained conflagrations, buildings burning through one after another with nobody there to douse them, yet not everything points to a single explosive night. In some quarters, there are signs of earlier disturbance. Walls that were already weakened before they collapsed in the fire. Storage jars that had clearly been opened and emptied before the flames reached them. Rooms that look more like they were being used as temporary dumps in the final phase than as well-kept living spaces. That hints at something more drawn out. Tension and disruption over weeks or months leading up to the final destruction. Raids in the countryside. Refugees coming in. Maybe parts of the city being abandoned before the last blow fell. But when you walk through the palace area in the excavation reports, the impression is not of a city calmly packing up and leaving. Scribes' rooms are found with tablets still stacked on benches or piled in baskets, fallen together when the shelves collapsed. Letters from foreign kings, inventories, contracts, legal disputes, none of them neatly archived away for a safe departure. They're just there, exactly where they were on the day someone last closed the door. Kitchens show large storage jars toppled and broken, grain spilled, grinding stones still in place. Workshops have tools scattered on floors, half-finished objects under layers of ash and debris. Loom weights lie where looms collapsed as their wooden frames burned. If Ugarit had been evacuated in an orderly way, you'd expect to see emptiness. Cleared storerooms, valuable goods removed, desirable bronze tools and weapons taken along. Instead you see a strange mix. Some things missing, others inexplicably left behind. Gold and easily portable luxury items seem to have been removed in many areas. That suggests at least some people had time to grab what they thought mattered most. But heavy bronze cauldrons, large storage jars, even some weapons remain. Not carefully stacked for storage, but lying where they fell. That's the archaeological signature of last-minute flight. Imagine the sequence. The warning signs have been building for months. Reports of enemy ships cruising the coast. Villages inland abandoned or burned. Letters going out from the palace, more and more urgent, to vassals, to the Hittite king, to anyone who might still send troops or ships. Day by day, the city's normal routines fray. Fewer caravans arrive, the market thins, more soldiers on the walls, scribes working late trying to keep up with the cascade of bad news. At some point the danger stops being an abstraction. Maybe scouts on the headland spot the shapes of unfamiliar ships on the horizon. Maybe a messenger staggers in from a neighbouring town that has already been attacked, clothes torn, eyes wild, babbling about fire and slaughter. What happens next isn't carved on any stone, but the pattern in the ruins suggests a rapid pivot from administration to survival. The palace, the heart of Ugarit's bureaucratic machine, turns into a fortress. Granaries are checked, weapons counted. Some rooms are emptied of movable wealth. Others get filled with supplies hurriedly dragged in from outside, turning reception halls into storage dumps. We know that the king, Amurapi, was still sending letters at this point. His famous message to the king of Al-Ashir, with its line about enemy ships having burned my cities and done evil things in my country, was written very, very late. The tablet itself was found in the debris of the palace, unfired when it was composed, later baked hard by the same fire that destroyed the building. That detail matters. Clay tablets start out as wet clay. A scribe writes on them with a reed stylus, and then usually they're dried in the sun or low-fired intentionally to harden them. But many everyday records in the Bronze Age were left only sun-dried, still somewhat fragile, vulnerable to water and time. At Ugarit, the destruction fire did what the scribes didn't. The heat turned stacks of administrative tablets, diplomatic letters, and legal records into ceramic. The palace became, unintentionally, a kiln. Shelves collapsed, baskets burned, roofs fell in, but the tablets themselves, now fired in an inferno, survived the next 3,000 years under the rubble. The catastrophe that silenced Ugarit is the reason we can still hear it. You can trace the fire room by room. In some places, the charred remains of wooden beams are still visible where they fell across floors. In others, the pattern of cracked mud brick shows where walls toppled in one direction rather than another, hinting at where the flames were strongest or which side of the building failed first. There's evidence of ceilings collapsing onto furnishings, trapping them under protective layers of rubble. But there are also eerie absences. Very few human skeletons have been found in the destruction debris of Ugarit itself. That doesn't necessarily mean there were no casualties. Bodies may have been removed later, or burned completely, or simply not yet found in the right contexts. But compared to some other ancient destruction layers that are full of victims, Ugarit's ruins are strangely empty of the dead. That emptiness could mean that many people managed to flee before the final fires swept the city. Maybe when the attackers came, the walls were manned but thinly. Maybe there was fighting at the gates, then a breach, then chaos. Parts of the population could have streamed out in panic, down to the harbour, trying to reach boats, up into the hills, hoping to hide in the countryside. Some would have made it, others wouldn't. Alternatively, it's possible that the city had already been partially evacuated, that in the weeks before the final blow, many families with means quietly left, taking what they could carry. What remained in the city on that last night might have been a mix of those who couldn't leave, those who wouldn't leave, and those whose job was to defend what was left of the king's authority. The archaeology can't tell us motives, it only records positions. A smashed storage jar in a corner is just a jar. A bronze spearhead wedged in a doorway is just metal. But when you map hundreds of those fragments across the site, patterns emerge. Concentrated burning in official quarters, less intense damage in some residential areas, pockets that look like they were looted before they were burned. That suggests attackers who were systematic. Whoever came, whether sea peoples, rival kingdoms, rebellious vassals, or some coalition of desperate groups, they didn't just set one fire and sail away. They moved through the city. They broke, took, and burned. The palace, symbol and instrument of royal power, seems to have been a primary target. Temples and major public buildings suffered heavily. Some peripheral neighbourhoods show lighter damage, as if flames reached them indirectly or after the main assault. Once the fires were lit, there was no one to organise a response extensive enough to save the city. Remember the climate-stressed kingdom we just talked about, the weakened tax base, the stretched supply lines, the unpaid soldiers, the refugees. All of that meant there were fewer hands to carry water, fewer reserves to feed a prolonged defence, fewer allies ready to ride to the rescue. So the flames did what flames always do when they meet close-packed mud brick and timber. They spread, found new fuel, climbed roof beams and ceiling reeds, roared through courtyards and along colonnades. For a few hours, maybe a day, Ugarit would have been a hell of heat, smoke and shouting. Then silence. Timbers burned through and crashed into courtyards. Roofs fell in and smothered some fires even as others smouldered on. Stored oil and pitch might have flared in sudden bursts. Eventually the blaze consumed what it could and died down to embers. Dust settled, ash drifted, the harbour silted, the market stayed empty. No one rebuilt the walls. From the perspective of the archaeological record, this is the most startling part. After that destruction layer, Ugarit does not reappear as a serious urban centre. There are later traces in the region, but the city as a functioning port kingdom is gone, a place that had been threaded into international correspondence networks, that had ships coming and going, that had scribes carefully copying diplomatic formulas, just stops. The last night of fire, in that sense, is both an event and a boundary. On one side, a living city with problems, yes, but with people still trying to solve them, still sending letters, still believing that help might arrive. On the other side, a silent ruin baking in the sun, its archives locked under collapsed roofs, its streets slowly filling with dust. When we open those archives now, when we read Amurapi's final pleas and the routine memos that came before them, we're eavesdropping on a world that ended in flame. To understand why the flames were not put out, why no army marched in time, why no fleet appeared at the harbour mouth, we have to step back again. Away from the city walls, out across the sea and inland to the other palaces that received Ugarit's letters, and ask a harder question. Where were they when Ugarit burned? To answer that, we have to remember something uncomfortable. In the late Bronze Age, nobody was watching a live map. There was no red blinking dot over Ugarit labelled under attack. No instant dispatch, no coordinated crisis room where someone could shout, "They're hitting our port, mobilise the fleet." There were only letters on clay, moving at the speed of a horse, a donkey, or a ship that had to wait for the right wind. So when Amurapi sent that last plea, when he wrote that enemy ships were burning his cities, he probably imagined that somewhere, in some other palace, a king would read those words, stand up, and give an order. But the truth is that almost everywhere his letters might have landed, people were already drowning in their own problems. Start with his theoretical big brother, the Hittite king. Ugarit, remember, was a vassal kingdom within the wider Hittite sphere. In normal times, that meant obligations, tribute, military support, loyalty. In return, the Hittite great king was supposed to provide protection, especially against big, organised enemies who showed up in fleets. On paper, that relationship looks solid. In practice, at the very end of the 13th century BC, the Hittite Empire was in trouble. We know from other texts that the Hittites were facing grain shortages so severe that their king was begging Egypt for emergency shipments. The core land in Anatolia had been hit hard by the same climate stress we saw around Ugarit. Droughts, failed harvests, poor yields. Internal revolts and border wars were chewing up whatever military capacity remained. Succession disputes had shaken the throne not long before. Even at the centre, power was fragile. So imagine being the Hittite great king, sitting in a palace in Hattusa that was itself struggling to get grain. You're trying to keep restive nobles in line, to put down rebellions, to stop enemy raids in the north, to manage a treasury that is shrinking instead of growing. Every day, messengers are arriving with bad news from some front. Then a tablet from Ugarit arrives. Enemy ships have come. My cities burn. How much spare power do you really have? Even if you want to help, you can't snap your fingers and make an army appear in Ugarit's harbour. You have to assemble troops from scattered estates, feed them, arm them, move them to the coast, find ships. That takes weeks in the best of times, and these were not the best of times. By the time a serious Hittite relief force could have been raised, moved and embarked, if such a force even existed anymore, Ugarit may already have been ashes. The same logic applies across the map. Egypt, the other major superpower of the age, loved to boast in inscriptions about crushing sea peoples with heroic vigour. Rameses III, a few decades after Ugarit's fall, would commission dramatic reliefs showing Egyptian archers and naval troops repelling foreign invaders in the Nile Delta. But those reliefs exist precisely because Egypt itself was under attack. The eastern Mediterranean in this period doesn't show a single localised crisis. It shows a chain reaction, harbours destroyed, palaces burned, cities abandoned, from Anatolia down to the Levant and across to Cyprus and beyond. At some sites the burn layers are almost exactly contemporary. At others, they follow in quick succession, like dominoes toppling along major trade routes. If you're looking for a single great rescuer standing untouched outside the chaos, you don't find one. You find more fires. This is what a system-wide breakdown looks like. In a normal diplomatic crisis, Ugarit's complaint might be one of a few urgent messages on a king's desk. In a systemic crisis, it's one desperate tablet in a pile of desperate tablets, each from a different vassal or ally, all screaming at once. My fields are burned. The roads are unsafe. My soldiers have deserted. My neighbours have attacked my towns. The letters we do have from this era hint at exactly that kind of chorus. Complaints about bandits, about vassals not sending troops, about shipments not arriving, about pirates or raiders along the coast. Everyone is pulling inward, trying to protect their own shrinking core, their own remaining grain, their own throne. Under those conditions, the idea of a coordinated multinational rescue fleet is almost fantasy. But even if the political will had been there, even if some king somewhere had decided we must save Ugarit, there were brutal practical limits. Bronze Age naval power was fragile. Most kingdoms did not maintain giant permanent war fleets. Ships were expensive, perishable, and very seasonal. Hulls had to be maintained constantly, or they leaked. Crews were drawn from peasant populations that needed to farm most of the year. When campaigning season ended, ships were often beached, dismantled, or left in harbour. Sailing itself was tied to rhythm, certain winds, certain currents, certain times when you dared hug the coast and others when you absolutely did not. There was no way to simply deploy the navy in winter, at night, in a storm. There was no all-weather, all-season response force sitting on standby. So even a willing ally would face the clock. First clock, communication. Amurapi's letter has to travel out. That's days, possibly weeks, depending on where it's going and how safe the roads and sea lanes still are. Second clock, decision-making. The foreign king has to read it, convene advisors, weigh the risks. Is this one more exaggerated panic from a vassal who cries wolf? Is this an existential threat? If I send ships, am I leaving my own coast defenceless? Third clock, mobilization. Crews have to be called up, ships readied, supplies gathered. In a world already suffering food shortages, loading grain onto ships for someone else's defence is a major, painful choice. By the time those 3 clocks have wound down, the situation at the target may be completely different. The enemy fleet that burned Ugarit may be gone. The city may already be looted, its people scattered. The relief force, if it arrives at all, sails into smoke and silence, and that's assuming everyone is acting in good faith, motivated purely by alliance and obligation. They weren't. The late Bronze Age diplomatic system was built on reciprocity and flattery, but it was still a world of rivalries. Every king wrote to others as brother, but in the background everyone was watching everyone else for weakness. Sometimes, another king's crisis was not your problem. Sometimes, it was your opportunity. If you are the ruler of a neighbouring port, and Ugarit, a trade competitor, is suddenly under attack, what do? Empty your treasury to save it? Or quietly strengthen your own walls, secure your own ships, and wait to see what emerges from the ashes? If you are a great king watching the Hittite sphere wobble, and one of their key coastal vassals is in trouble, do you rush to save Hittite prestige? Or do you let the fire burn around your rival, then move in later to pick up whatever pieces are left? We don't have an explicit tablet where some cynical king writes, "Excellent, Ugarit is on fire, let's do nothing." Ancient rulers did not put that kind of calculation in writing. But political logic doesn't need a document to be real. When resources are tight and threats are everywhere, every decision to help someone is also a decision to expose yourself. It is entirely plausible that some potential allies read or heard about Ugarit's plight and chose quietly not to get involved, or simply could not get involved without endangering their own survival. So Amurapi's letter goes out into a network that is no longer functioning as a network. The same roads that once carried caravans of tin and copper are being harassed by raiders or blocked by enemy troops. The same ports that once bustled with merchants are half abandoned or under their own threat. Scribes in other palaces are also writing urgent dispatches, also begging for aid that may never arrive. When we talk about collapse, this is what we're really talking about. Not just walls falling and cities burning, but the invisible threads between them snapping one after another. The phone lines going dead. The assumption that someone will come, will send, will fix this. Evaporating, often without anyone realizing it until too late. For generations, Ugarit had lived inside that web of mutual expectation. You send tribute, you receive protection. You host merchants, you receive grain. You send gifts, you receive gifts. The system might creak, might fail sometimes, but overall it holds. Then, at some point in the early 12th century BC, a king stands in a palace that is starting to feel less like the centre of a stable world and more like the last intact room in a burning house. He dictates a letter asking for help as if the old rules still apply, and he sends it into a world where those rules are dissolving. Maybe someone far away did read it. Maybe a scribe somewhere rolled his eyes at yet another disaster report. Maybe a king swore to gather ships as soon as the harvest was in. Maybe an order was given that, on wax tablets and in shouted commands, briefly promised Ugarit a rescue that never left the harbour. We'll never know. What we do know is what the archaeology and the clay tablets together insist on. No one arrived in time with enough force to matter. The enemy ships came, the fires burned, the palace collapsed. Amurapi's last plea survived, not because an ally answered it, but because the flames that consumed his city accidentally baked his words for us. A letter that was meant to trigger an action ended up as evidence of the opposite, a message sent into a system that was itself shattering. To see what that shattering really means, how a city can go from bustling port to permanent ruin in a generation, we have to follow Ugarit beyond its last night, not forward in its own history, because its own history effectively stops, but outward, into the way it disappears from everyone else's. On paper, Ugarit dies in a night. In reality, the death of a city is much messier. Archaeologists talk about two very different fates for ancient places: continuous occupation and abandonment. A continuously occupied city is noisy in the archaeological record. People keep living there. They rebuild, repair, remodel. New houses go up over old ones. Streets shift. Drains get dug. Walls get patched. Pottery styles change. Writing systems evolve. Temples are repurposed instead of flattened. From the ground, centuries later, that looks like a layered cake. You dig down and every slice is another time period. You can trace a city's life through fire, plague, regime change, but the thread never quite breaks. Ugarit is not that. At Ugarit, the thread snaps. What we see in the ground is brutally simple: a wealthy late Bronze Age city with an archive full of letters, a palace, temples, houses, storerooms, workshops. Then a destruction layer: burned beams, collapsed walls, smashed pottery, arrowheads, sling stones, fallen roof tiles, and above that, almost nothing. No clear rebuild, no big new architectural phase, no centuries of continuous occupation smoothing over the scars. On the surface, that looks like disappearance. One moment, Amurapi is writing about enemy ships. The next, silence. But people do not vanish in a puff of smoke, so where did they go? One option is the most obvious and also the easiest to forget. They left. When a city like Ugarit is burned badly enough, palace, granaries, temples, port facilities, you don't just sweep the ashes and go back to normal. Your food stores are gone. Your rulers might be dead. Your trade contacts are severed. The army that was supposed to protect you has either been destroyed, deserted, or marched away with the invaders. If you survive that night, if you're one of the people who manages to avoid slaughter, fire, or capture, you wake up in a ruin with no clear way to feed your family. In that scenario, staying might be the most dangerous thing you can do, so people walk. Some go inland, following old caravan routes in reverse, heading towards smaller farming villages that weren't worth burning. Others attach themselves to surviving estates in the countryside, offering labour in exchange for food. Some flee along the coast, looking for other harbours that still function, other kings still strong enough to enforce order, and once they arrive, they merge. A family of former Ugaritic merchants might turn up in a village 30 kilometres inland, with nothing but the clothes they're wearing and a hazy story about troubles at the coast. They marry into local families. They share some of their knowledge, how to keep accounts, how to weigh goods, how to negotiate with foreign traders, but they adopt local customs, local dialect. Within a generation or two, their grandchildren are just villagers. Their great-grandchildren might remember that an ancestor came from the sea or from a big city that burned, but the name Ugarit may already be fading. From an archaeological point of view, that looks like nothing special. The village was there before, it's there after. Pottery changes a little, house styles shift a little, but those things are always changing. Unless you can trace a very specific, distinctive style from Ugarit popping up somewhere else, the absorption of its survivors vanishes into the background hum of normal human movement. That's one way a city disappears, not because everyone dies, but because no one stays where we expect to find them. Another way is more subtle. People stay, but the city changes identity. Imagine a burned Ugarit still sitting in a strategically valuable spot, a good natural harbour, a defensible headland, access to inland roads. That kind of location doesn't stop being useful just because one political system collapsed. You could easily have a small group of survivors or newcomers from nearby regions trickle back over the next few decades and start using the ruins. Not rebuilding a palace, not restoring a royal archive, just reoccupying bits and pieces. Maybe a family clears rubble from part of a former administrative building and turns it into a courtyard house. Maybe fishermen drag their boats up on the same beach where Mycenaean traders once anchored. Maybe a local warlord sets up a fortified compound on a corner of the old citadel, using fallen stones from royal walls as cheap building material. From their point of view, they're living in a practical spot with ready-made foundations. From our point of view, the city of Ugarit is gone, because what made it Ugarit wasn't just stone and brick. It was the palace, the bureaucracy, the feel of a place plugged into a long-distance network of letters and trade. And that brings us to something even more important than burned walls: writing. Ugarit wasn't just another town. It was a literate kingdom. Its scribes used multiple scripts: Akkadian cuneiform, Egyptian hieroglyphs, and a unique alphabetic cuneiform of their own invention. They recorded treaties, legal cases, tax lists, royal correspondence, religious myths. Their tablets are why we can hear Hammurabi's voice at all. But that entire ecosystem of writing was tied to the palace. Scribes were trained there, archives were stored there. The need for complex record-keeping of grain rations, corvée labour, diplomatic gifts came from the palace administration and the temples it supported. When those institutions burn, the demand for scribes collapses overnight. A fisherman who moves back into the ruins doesn't need a full bilingual scribe to track his nets. A small local strongman may manage his followers with memory, tallies on sticks, or a handful of simple marks, not with shelves of clay tablets naming foreign kings. If the new occupants of the site are poorer, more local, less plugged into international trade, literacy can simply evaporate. The last generation of palace-trained scribes might die in the destruction or flee with the refugees. They may try to pass on their skills to children, but without a state apparatus that needs and funds those skills, writing quickly shrinks from a living, adaptable tool into a ritual, or disappears altogether. From our perspective, that looks like a blackout. Before the collapse, Ugarit is noisy. Hundreds of tablets, multiple languages, a rich written record of who was sending what to whom. Afterward, nothing is written down on durable clay in that script anywhere we've found. The culture that knew how to make those tablets didn't vanish by magic. It just no longer had the institutional life support it needed to keep going. And if the scripts die, the history goes with them. Think about what that means. You can have survivors from Ugarit telling their story in nearby villages for decades. You can have a memory of the old city living in songs, in genealogies, in whispered warnings about raids from the sea. But if no one is fixing those memories in writing that we can recover, they disappear when the storytellers do. Add to that another problem. The earth itself does not cooperate with our desire for clear narratives. Coastlines move. In the 3,000+ years since Ugarit burned, sea levels have shifted. Storms have rearranged shorelines. Rivers have changed course, dumping sediment into harbours, silting up inlets that were once deep enough for bronze-laden ships. Some late Bronze Age ports that were right on the water are now inland, half buried under centuries of alluvium. Others may have been eaten away by erosion, their outer districts literally falling into the sea. Wharf installations, warehouses, shipyards can be destroyed not just by raiders, but by centuries of waves and storms. On top of that, people keep building. Later villagers may quarry stone from the ruins. Medieval farmers may terrace over ancient walls. A modern town might sit directly on top of what used to be a palace, its foundations chewing through older layers like teeth. Every time someone digs a new well, ploughs a new field, or levels a mound for a new house, they can destroy another slice of the archaeological record. Not maliciously, just by living. So when we walk a coastal plain today and we don't see Ugarit on a road sign, that doesn't mean the people who survived Hammurabi's catastrophe left no trace. It often means their traces are scattered, buried, eroded, or overwritten by everything that came after. That's what vanished really means in history. It doesn't mean a city pulled up its foundations and teleported into the sky. It means a set of institutions, practices, and identities were disrupted so violently that their continuity breaks. The palace that once ordered tablets baked and stored collapses. The scribes who once maintained a continuous written memory lose their patrons. The trade networks that once justified a big, organised port shrink back to local exchange. The survivors scatter, blend, adapt, call themselves by new names. From inside that process, it probably doesn't feel like vanishing. It feels like crisis, then improvisation, then a rough new normal. From the outside, 3,000 years later, looking back through a few burned walls and a last desperate letter, it feels like a sudden silence. Ugarit vanished, because the things that made it visible to us, its writing, its bureaucracy, its role in a massive international system, were exactly the things the collapse destroyed. The people went on. The city as a historical voice did not, and Ugarit was not the only one. All along the eastern Mediterranean, other ports, other palaces, other proud centres of bureaucracy and trade hit the same wall. To see what that looked like on a civilizational scale, how an entire world of bronze chariots and letters on clay could fall quiet almost at once, we have to zoom out from this one harbour and watch the wider map go dark. If you pull the camera back from Ugarit and look at the whole eastern Mediterranean around 1200 BC, you don't see one dot going dark. You see a constellation flickering, then whole sections of the sky going black. To the north, the Hittite Empire had been one of the great powers of the Late Bronze Age, a land of fortified capitals, vassal kings, and clay archives, every bit as bureaucratic as Ugarit's. Just a few decades before Amurapi's letter, Hattusa, the Hittite capital, was sending out armies, negotiating with Egypt, dictating terms to smaller states. By the time Ugarit burned, Hattusa itself was gone. Not gone in the sense of a peaceful retirement. Gone in the sense of burned levels, deserted citadels, archives smashed and left to rot. The central Hittite state disintegrated. Its writing tradition in cuneiform stopped. Later Iron Age people in the same region still remembered some kind of heroic Hittite past, but the old imperial machine was finished. To the west, across the wine-dark sea that Amurapi's scribes wrote about, the palaces of the Mycenaean world were following a similar arc. Places like Mycenae, Pylos, Tiryns, massive complexes ringed by cyclopean stone walls, had dominated mainland Greece. They ran their kingdoms with their own bureaucratic script, linear B, tracking sheep and bronze and perfumed oil with fussy precision. Then, over roughly the same few generations, their palaces burned. Archive rooms baked into accidental time capsules. Linear B vanishes from the record. For a long stretch, Greece falls into what older historians called a dark age. Smaller settlements, no big palaces, no surviving writing. Along the Levantine coast, the pattern repeats in slightly different rhythms. Some cities are wiped out, Ugarit of course, but also places like Alalach and other ports and inland towns. Others stagger but survive, sometimes through multiple destruction layers and rebuilds. Hazor in the north shows fire and collapse. Ashkelon and other coastal sites see waves of destruction and reoccupation. Farther south, in Egypt, the light never quite goes out, but it definitely flickers. Egyptian inscriptions from the reigns of Meneptah and Rameses III brag about defeating sea peoples, about shattered fleets and piles of enemies. They carve scenes of chaotic battles, ships locked together, archers firing, foreign warriors tumbling into the water. Behind the victory stories, though, you can read the stress. Grain shipments are disrupted. Garrisons in Canaan are lost. The empire pulls back its borders, abandons distant holdings, tightens control at home. Rameses III wins his battles, but Egypt after him is smaller, poorer, and less outward-facing than the Egypt that signed golden treaties with the Hittites. So Ugarit's fall wasn't an isolated tragedy. It was one tile in a mosaic of crisis that stretched from the Aegean to Mesopotamia. What makes this period so strange is that it doesn't just destroy cities, it dismantles a whole way of organising the world. Before the collapse, the Eastern Mediterranean was a network of palatial states. These weren't countries, in the modern sense. They were systems built around a royal centre, a palace that controlled farmland, labour, temples, trade, and often the writing system itself. Wealth came in as taxed grain and tribute. Wealth went out as rations, bronze equipment, diplomatic gifts. Scribes tracked it all. If you were a farmer in the countryside, your life ran on palace rhythms, corvée labour seasons, tax assessments, orders from officials. If you were a merchant, you sailed because your king had a treaty with another king. If you were a scribe, your career existed because that palace needed its information managed. That's what burns in the 12th century. Not just buildings, but palatial bureaucracy as a dominant model. In the Iron Age that follows, the political landscape looks very different. Instead of a few massive, highly centralised kingdoms controlling long-distance trade, we see a patchwork of smaller, more independent polities. City-states, local chieftains, tribal groups, loose confederations. In the regions that had been Hittite, new Neo-Hittite and Aramaean kingdoms emerge, smaller than the old empire, speaking related languages, carving their own inscriptions in new scripts, ruling from more modest capitals. In the Levant, new players appear on the map, the emerging kingdoms of Israel and Judah in the highlands, the Aramaean states inland, and along the coast, the Phoenician cities, Tyre, Sidon, Byblos, who will become the great seafarers of the early Iron Age. On the Greek mainland and islands, centuries after the Mycenaean palaces burn, new forms of community crystallize. The polis, the city-state, with its own assemblies, its own local identity, and eventually its own alphabetic writing. This is the era when iron tools and weapons stop being rare luxuries and start becoming everyday technology. Agricultural practices shift. New social structures appear. Old royal houses vanish, and new elites rise, from warrior bands, from merchant families, from charismatic local leaders. If you only look at the palaces, it can feel like a story of pure rupture. Everything burned, then something totally different rose from the ashes. The reality is more tangled. Even in catastrophe, people carry things forward. Some of the pottery styles that appear in early Iron Age settlements trace clear roots back into late Bronze Age traditions. Religious practices adapt but don't disappear. Deities worshipped in Ugarit's time, like Baal and El, show up in later Iron Age texts under slightly different names and with slightly different stories, but recognisably related. Craft knowledge survives because craftspeople survive. A bronzesmith who once made fittings for a palace chariot can make tools for a village chief. A shipwright whose yard burned in a sea people's raid can hire out his skills in a smaller harbour. The scale changes. The expertise doesn't evaporate overnight. Trade routes don't vanish. They warp. The big formalised exchange of palatial embassies and royal gifts weakens, but people still move along the same coasts and through the same mountain passes. In the centuries after the collapse, Phoenician merchants will sail out along routes that Mycenaean and Ugaritic captains once knew, but with different cargoes, different partners, different political backing. Even writing, which seems to go dark in many places, doesn't die so much as mutate. In the Levant, alphabetic scripts, simpler than full cuneiform systems, easier to learn and spread, take root and evolve. The Phoenician alphabet will eventually give rise to Greek, then Latin, then the scripts that many of us use today. There's a real irony here. Ugarit itself had experimented with an alphabetic cuneiform. Its scribes had taken the complex system of wedge signs and trimmed it down to a sign for each sound. It was an early alphabet baked in clay. That specific script does not survive the destruction of the palace that used it. But the broader alphabetic idea continues elsewhere, in slightly different forms, through people who lived through the same upheavals. Historians still argue about why this shift from late Bronze Age to Iron Age happened the way it did. Was climate change the main driver? Decades of drought-weakening agriculture, making states brittle and turning hungry people into raiders and migrants? Were the so-called Sea Peoples organised coalitions of displaced groups sweeping along the coasts? Or were they more like a symptom, assorted migrants, pirates and mercenaries taking advantage of already failing systems? How much did earthquakes matter? Some destruction levels line up suspiciously well with known seismic zones and with patterns of collapsed walls and toppled statues. And what about internal problems? Class tensions, over-centralised bureaucracies, dependence on long-distance bronze supply chains that could snap with one bad year in Cyprus. The answer, as far as current evidence suggests, is all of the above, interacting in complex ways. Different regions fall at slightly different times. Some cities burn once, others burn, rebuild and burn again. The collapse is not a single event, but a rolling, uneven process that plays out over decades. That's why the chronology is still debated. Radiocarbon dates can be fuzzy. Pottery styles don't come with timestamps. Inscriptions, when they exist, tell you what a king wanted remembered, not always what actually happened. In that confusion, Ugarit's archive has an outsized power, because here, uniquely, we have a city that was still writing right up until almost the moment it died. Those tablets in Amurapi's palace are like a time capsule sealed in fire. They preserve not just a diplomatic system, but a mood, the rising sense of threat, the dependence on distant allies, the confidence that someone somewhere will come if the worst happens. They show us what the late Bronze Age world looked like from the inside, not just from the ruins left behind. And then, in their sudden silence, they mark the edge of an era. After Ugarit, after Hattusa, after Pylos and so many others, the Mediterranean will rebuild itself into a new shape. Iron Age kingdoms, alphabetic scripts, new trade empires. Eventually, centuries later, that world will give birth to the classical civilizations we read about in school. But under all of that, baked in clay and buried in a ruined palace by the sea, lies a final letter from a king who lived at the end of the Age of Bronze. His world did not survive. His words did. And because of that, 3,000 years later, we can still listen to the last breath of a city that thought help might be on the way. When you strip away the romance of ruins and the neat labels on museum cases, you're left with something brutally simple. Hammurabi's letter is a man realizing, almost in real time, that the system he trusted is failing him. He reaches for the tools that have always worked. Formal address, diplomatic language, the assumption that kings help kings, that grain and soldiers and ships can be summoned along well-worn routes, and all those habits, all that infrastructure, all those promises, crumble faster than his scribes can press wedges into clay. That's why this one tablet hits so hard. It isn't a monument written after the fact, polishing the story. It's not a literary epic shaped by centuries of retelling. It's a snapshot of a world in freefall taken a few weeks before the camera itself shatters. Looking back with 3,000 years of hindsight, it's tempting to hunt for a single culprit. The one neat sentence that explains why the city vanished and the letter turned into a time capsule. But the more evidence we dig up, the less a single cause story fits. You can see the fingerprints of climate stress in the tree rings and sediment cores. Years of drought that would have thinned harvests, strained granaries, made every shipment of grain more precious. You can see the violence in the burn layers and arrowheads, the smashed walls and hurried hordes of buried valuables, raids, invasions, perhaps organized coalitions of sea peoples, perhaps desperate neighbors turned predators. You can see the fragility of the system itself in the way everything falls together. A world where bronze depends on distant copper and tin, where palaces run on surplus skimmed from peasants, where writing and law and long-distance trade are all tied to a handful of royal courts. Pull enough threads at once, bad harvests, refugee movements, earthquakes in the wrong place, battles lost at sea, and the tapestry doesn't fray. It rips. Most historians working on this period now lean toward that kind of multi-cause cascading failure picture. Not one hammer blow, but a storm of smaller impacts that, together, overwhelmed a network that had grown too tight, too specialized, too dependent on everything going right. But there's still room for argument. Maybe you think prolonged drought was the real killer, and everything else was just aftershocks. Maybe you see the sea peoples not as opportunists, but as the main driving force, turning a stressed system into a burning one. Maybe you think internal tensions, angry farmers, overtaxed communities, rigid elites, meant these kingdoms were already hollow, just waiting for a spark. So here's where I want to hand the story back to you. If you had to choose, what mattered most in the end of Ugarit's world? War, drought, system collapse, something else entirely? Tell me your theory in the comments, and while you're there, let me know where you're listening from. One of the strangest legacies of this vanished city is that its last cry can now be heard in bedrooms and buses and kitchens all over the modern world. If you've enjoyed travelling back to the last days of Ugarit, tap like so more people can find this episode, subscribe if you'd like more deep dives into the edges of history, and hit the bell so you don't miss what's coming next. And if you want to go even further back, beyond the Bronze Age, into the deep prehistory of our species, through other bottlenecks and near misses, I've put those stories into a book about the prehistoric secrets written in our genes and our stones. You can read more about it and pick up a copy at sleepytimehistory.com. Hammurabi's letter survived because clay, by accident, is tougher than wood and ink and memory. Most voices from collapsing worlds are not so lucky. We stand on the far shore of his disaster, reading his last attempt to hold the line. We can't send the ships he begged for, but we can do one small thing he would have understood perfectly. We can make sure his words are not forgotten.